The most dangerous moment in human existence isn't when you're facing external catastrophe or physical peril. It's when you're sitting in perfect safety, surrounded by everything society tells you should make you happy, and you feel absolutely nothing. This isn't about depression or clinical emptiness. This is about the terrifying recognition that you've been living someone else's life so completely that you've forgotten what your own heartbeat sounds like. We've all been there, trapped in conversations that feel like elaborate performances, wearing masks we've grown so accustomed to that we mistake them for our actual face, pursuing goals that seemed important until we achieved them and discovered they were just elaborate distractions from the one question we're all avoiding. Who are you when no one is watching, when no one is judging, when no one needs anything from you? Joseph Campbell spent decades studying the mythic patterns that run beneath all human stories, and he discovered something that cuts through every comfortable illusion we've built about modern life. He found that every culture, every age, every human soul carries within it the same fundamental narrative, the story of someone who must leave the safe, predictable world they've known and venture into territory where the old maps no longer work, where the familiar comforts no longer satisfy, where they must discover who they actually are beneath all the roles they've been playing. But here's what Campbell understood that most people miss entirely. This isn't just ancient mythology or inspiring folklore. This is the most practical, immediate reality of anyone who has ever felt that strange restlessness, that inexplicable hunger for something they can't name, that growing awareness that the life they're living doesn't quite fit the shape of their soul. You know this feeling. It's the moment when you catch yourself in the middle of a routine you've performed 1,000 times and suddenly feel like you're watching someone else's life through your own eyes. It's the strange emptiness that follows achieving something you thought you wanted. It's the growing inability to lose yourself in distractions that used to work perfectly. It's the uncomfortable recognition that most of the conversations you have, most of the relationships you maintain, most of the activities that fill your days are elaborate ways of avoiding the most important conversation you could ever have, the one with your own authentic nature. This is what Campbell would recognize immediately as the call to adventure. Not the kind of adventure you see in movies, but the most radical adventure possible. The journey away from mechanical existence and toward conscious living. Away from unconscious imitation and toward authentic self-expression. Away from the safe harbor of social approval and toward the open ocean of genuine aliveness. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The moment you begin to hear this call, the moment you start to sense that there might be a way of living that actually corresponds to who you are rather than who you think you should be, you realize that following this call requires something that feels almost impossible in our connected, validated, constantly stimulated world. It requires solitude. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the sacred aloneness of someone who is learning to distinguish between their own voice and the chorus of expectations that has been singing in their head since childhood. Most people interpret this as antisocial behavior, as depression, as something gone wrong. They offer solutions, more socializing, more activities, more goals to pursue, more ways to reconnect with the world you're sensing you need to step away from. But Campbell knew better. He understood that every hero's journey begins with what appears to be withdrawal, but is actually the deepest form of engagement possible, engagement with the mystery of your own existence. This isn't about rejecting the world or declaring yourself superior to those who haven't begun this journey. This is about recognizing that consciousness itself requires a kind of stepping back, a pause in the mechanical momentum of unconscious living, a willingness to stop performing long enough to discover what you might actually have to offer when you're no longer trying to be what everyone else needs you to be. The path ahead is uncertain. It will challenge everything you think you know about success, relationships, and what it means to live a meaningful life. But it's the only path that leads toward the possibility of waking up in your own life rather than sleepwalking through someone else's expectations of what your life should look like. When Campbell spoke of crossing the threshold, he was describing something far more subtle and profound than the dramatic departures we see in adventure stories. He was pointing to that moment when you realize that the discomfort you've been feeling, the restlessness you've been trying to cure with more stimulation or more success or more connection, isn't a problem to be solved. It's a doorway to be walked through. This threshold isn't a geographical location. It's a psychological and spiritual territory that exists in the space between who you've been and who you might become if you stopped trying to fit into patterns that were never designed for your particular shape. It's that strange realm where the old rules no longer seem to apply, where the motivations that used to drive you lose their power, where you find yourself unable to pretend that surface-level interactions satisfy the deeper hunger you're beginning to acknowledge. The crossing begins when you stop interpreting your growing need for solitude as loneliness and start recognizing it as the natural requirement of a consciousness that is learning to differentiate between authentic impulses and conditioned responses. You begin to notice how much of what you thought was your own thinking is actually the echo of voices that were never yours. Family expectations, cultural programming, social media influences, the invisible pressure to be productive, successful, constantly improving, always moving towards some externally defined version of happiness. In this threshold space, you discover something both liberating and initially terrifying. You have permission to stop, to sit with your own experience without immediately trying to fix it, improve it, or escape from it, to listen to the subtle rhythms of your own nature without the constant background noise of other people's needs, opinions, and expectations, to explore what emerges when you're not performing, not producing, not trying to be anything other than consciously present to what is actually happening in your inner landscape. This is where Campbell's understanding of the mythic structure becomes invaluable practical guidance. He knew that this phase of apparent withdrawal, this time of inner listening, isn't preparation for the real journey. It is the journey. Every moment you spend learning to distinguish between your authentic desires and your conditioned responses, every hour you invest in understanding what actually brings you alive versus what you think should bring you alive. Every day you choose conscious solitude over unconscious stimulation is moving you deeper into the most important adventure of your life. But solitude, as Campbell understood it, isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting human connection. It's about developing the inner strength and clarity that makes genuine connection possible for the first time. When you're no longer desperately seeking validation, approval, or distraction from others, when you're no longer performing roles or managing impressions, you become available for the kind of relationships that actually nourish the soul, rather than merely filling time or meeting social expectations. This is the sacred aloneness that every mystic, every artist, every genuine innovator has had to embrace, not as an escape from the world, but as the only way to discover what you actually have to offer the world. In this threshold space, you begin to access resources within yourself that you never knew existed. Creativity that had been buried under years of practical concerns. Intuition that had been shouted down by rational analysis. A capacity for wonder and genuine curiosity that had been nearly suffocated by cynicism and the need to appear sophisticated. You start to trust your instincts in ways that might seem almost supernatural to a mind trained to doubt everything but external authority. You begin to recognize the deeper patterns that connect things in ways that pure logic cannot map. You discover that following what actually interests you, what actually excites you, what actually calls to your authentic nature isn't selfish indulgence. It's the most practical thing you can do if you want to live a life that feels genuinely yours. And to you who recognize yourself in this description, who have felt the pull away from mechanical existence and toward something more real, I want to extend an invitation. Think of this not just as watching a video, but as joining a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. The ancient dialogue between those who choose consciousness over comfort, authenticity over approval, inner wisdom over external validation. Subscribe not just to this channel, but to this timeless community of fellow travelers. Share in the comments not just your thoughts, but your own experience of hearing the call, of standing at the threshold, of choosing the uncertain path of awakening, even when it means walking away from everything familiar. You're not alone in this journey, even when the path requires solitude. What Campbell discovered through his study of countless myths and stories is that the threshold crossing is just the beginning. Once you've stepped away from unconscious participation in collective dreams, once you've begun the delicate work of distinguishing between your authentic nature and your conditioned responses, you enter what he called the road of trials. And here's what no one prepares you for. The trials aren't primarily external challenges or dramatic confrontations. They're the subtle, persistent tests of your commitment to consciousness in a world that rewards unconsciousness. The first trial is the loneliness of clarity. when you begin to see through the masks everyone wears, when you recognize the mechanical nature of most social interactions, when you're no longer satisfied by conversations that never venture beneath the surface, you find yourself in a very particular kind of isolation. Not the isolation of social rejection, but the isolation of someone who has learned to hear harmonies that others miss, who can no longer pretend that surface noise is music. This isn't about thinking you're better than others. It's about the natural consequence of developing inner hearing in a world that has grown deaf to its own depths. You begin to crave authentic communication, the kind that acknowledges the mystery of existence, that touches the soul, that honors the profound questions we're all carrying. And when such communication is rare, when most interactions feel like eating cardboard after you've tasted real food, the temptation is enormous to believe you've made a mistake, that consciousness is a burden rather than a gift. But Campbell knew that this trial, this test of your willingness to remain awake even when awakeness feels like punishment, is actually preparing you for something extraordinary. Because as you learn to be comfortable in your own authentic presence, as you develop the capacity to be genuinely alone without being desperately lonely, you begin to emanate something that draws other conscious beings toward you, like a beacon in the darkness. The connections that emerge from this authenticity are unlike anything you've experienced before. These aren't relationships based on mutual unconsciousness, shared complaints, or convenient compatibility. They're connections forged in the recognition of consciousness itself, bonds formed between people who have each done the difficult work of learning who they are beneath their conditioned identities. When you meet someone else who has chosen the path of authentic being over social performance, the recognition is immediate and profound. This is the treasure Campbell spoke of, not gold or power or external achievement, but the discovery that genuine intimacy is possible, but only between people who have first learned to be intimate with themselves, love that doesn't depend on unconsciousness, friendship that supports growth rather than enabling stagnation, community that celebrates uniqueness rather than demanding conformity. But even this treasure comes with its own trials, because now you must learn to live simultaneously in both worlds, the world of surface interactions and social obligations, and the world of depth and authentic connection. You must find ways to be genuine without being judgmental, to maintain your authenticity without becoming isolated, to offer your gifts without forcing them on those who aren't ready to receive them. This is perhaps the most sophisticated challenge of the journey, learning to be a bridge between worlds, someone who can function effectively in ordinary reality while remaining rooted in the extraordinary truth you've discovered. It requires a kind of spiritual maturity that most people never develop, the ability to be fully present in surface conversations without losing touch with depth, to meet people where they are without betraying where you are. Campbell understood that this mastery of two worlds isn't just a personal achievement, it's a form of service to the collective awakening of humanity. Your very existence becomes a kind of permission for others to consider that there might be another way to live, another way to be human that they haven't yet explored, not through preaching or proselytizing, but simply through the radical act of being genuinely yourself in a world full of people wearing masks they've forgotten they're wearing. Your freedom gives others permission to be free. Your authenticity reminds others that authenticity is possible. Your willingness to choose consciousness over comfort creates spaces where others can risk their own vulnerability, their own movement toward truth. And to you who have made it this far, who recognize yourself in this ancient pattern of awakening, I want to say this with all the warmth and recognition of one traveler speaking to another. You are not crazy. You are not selfish. You are not broken. You are participating in the oldest, most necessary story humanity knows, the story of consciousness awakening to itself through individual human beings, brave enough to choose truth over comfort, depth over surface, being over seeming. Keep walking this path. Share your journey not as someone who has arrived, but as someone still discovering. The world needs what you're becoming, even if it doesn't know how to ask for it. The return in Campbell's understanding of the heroic journey reveals its true purpose. Only when you realize that you never actually left the world, you learn to inhabit it consciously. The integration you've been working toward isn't about compartmentalizing your spiritual insights and your practical responsibilities. It's about discovering that there is no separation between inner transformation and outer effectiveness, between authentic being and skillful living in the world of forms and relationships and daily obligations. What emerges from this integration is something that might surprise you. The solitude you once needed so desperately begins to transform into a quality of inner spaciousness that you carry with you regardless of external circumstances. You discover that you can be alone in a crowd and connected in solitude, that the peace you found in stepping away from unconscious participation in collective dreams has become a portable sanctuary that travels with you wherever life calls you to engage. This is not the detachment of someone who has given up on the world, but the engagement of someone who has learned to participate in life from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, presence rather than anxiety, authentic response rather than conditioned reaction. Work becomes play when you're no longer trying to prove anything or escape from anything, but simply expressing what wants to emerge through your unique combination of gifts and circumstances. Relationships become celebrations of consciousness, recognizing itself in different forms, rather than negotiations between two sets of unmet needs and unhealed wounds. Even difficulties transform their meaning when you're no longer unconsciously resisting what is, but consciously participating in what wants to unfold through you. Challenges become invitations to deeper surrender to the intelligence of life itself. Obstacles become opportunities to discover resources within yourself that only emerge under pressure. Loss becomes a doorway to recognizing what can never be lost, the awareness that is your deepest nature, the consciousness that remains constant beneath all the changing circumstances of your outer life. This realization that following your bliss isn't ultimately about getting what you want, but about discovering that what you most deeply want is to be aligned with what life wants to express through you, transforms everything. You begin to understand that your individual awakening is not separate from the collective awakening of humanity, that your personal journey toward authenticity is simultaneously a contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. Campbell's great gift was helping us see that we are all participants in a story much larger than our individual concerns, much more meaningful than our personal achievements, much more mysterious than our minds can comprehend. We are consciousness awakening to itself through billions of unique human expressions, each one a necessary thread in a tapestry of becoming that spans the entire history of our species. Your willingness to leave the familiar world of unconscious existence, to face the trials of authentic living, to develop the resources necessary to be genuinely yourself in a world full of people hiding from themselves. This isn't just personal growth. This is evolutionary service. This is how consciousness evolves, one individual at a time, choosing truth over comfort, awareness over sleep, authentic expression over safe conformity. The journey you've been on, the solitude you've learned to embrace, the connections you've discovered on the other side of loneliness, the integration you're now living, all of this is preparing you to be what Campbell called a master of two worlds. Someone who can navigate ordinary reality with extraordinary consciousness, who can engage fully in the world of time and form while remaining rooted in the timeless awareness that is your essential nature. And perhaps most beautifully, you discover that the bliss you've been following was never really yours to begin with. It was life itself, the creative force of the universe, seeking expression through your particular configuration of talents, interests, challenges, and circumstances. Following your bliss wasn't selfish. It was the most selfless thing you could do, because it aligned you with the deepest intelligence of existence itself. This is Campbell's ultimate message, that we are all heroes in our own mythic journey, all called to leave the known world of mechanical existence and venture into the unknown territory of conscious being. The path is different for each of us, but the pattern is universal. Departure from unconsciousness, initiation into authenticity, return with gifts for a world hungry for what only conscious beings can offer. So if you've felt the call, if you've stood at the threshold, if you've chosen the uncertain path of awakening even when it led away from everything familiar, know that you are participating in the most sacred story humanity has ever told. The story of consciousness discovering itself through the vehicle of human experience. The universe is dreaming itself awake through you. Trust the process. Trust the journey. Trust that your authentic nature has something unique and necessary to offer to a world desperately in need of what only you can give.